What is going on, everybody? Welcome back again. So as you can see, I've already taken the transmission back out of the car. So we are getting really close to finally having this guy back in the engine bay, but there's a couple things that we have to do first. So in this episode, right, I've already taken the transmission out. I'm going to drop the front subframe and go ahead and pressure wash that, get it cleaned up. The engine mounts are actually the hoist brackets are actually still the powder coater. So I'm not going to be able to lift this guy into place just yet. I don't want to take a chance of rigging it up and then scratching the powder coating. So I'm going to wait for the brackets, but we can at least get the front subframe all cleaned up, prepped, ready to go. So when I do get the brackets on, go ahead and mate everything up. But we'll go ahead and pull that out, get that cleaned up, and then we'll start running the Dash 8 hardline. So a couple things in this video we're going to address. Let's get started. So when we go to drop the front subframe, it's actually pretty straightforward, but there is a couple of things that we need to address on the engine bay or inside the engine bay from the top side first, and then we'll go ahead and take a look at each wheel well and what we have to disconnect there. Inside the engine bay, all we have to do is disconnect this line coming from our power steering to the reservoir, and then we're just going to go ahead and loosen the collar on where the spline portion of the input shaft is for the steering wheel. And that's basically it. So we're going to go ahead and hit those two things, and then we'll take a look at the wheel well. If we go ahead and take a look in the wheel well here, this is the driver's side. So part of it has already been disassembled for getting that axle out of the way when you pull the engine. So on either side, we're going to want to remove our tie rod from the steering rack. You're going to want to disconnect your lower control arm and then the end link from the sway bar. And that's pretty much it. So we're going to go ahead and get those disconnected on either side, and then we'll work on the fasteners for the subframe itself. Now we just have 4 fasteners on either side of the subframe. So on the front part, you see those 2 fasteners there. And if we move to the back side, you can see the fasteners on that side there. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and remove the 4 nuts on both sides of the subframe for the driver and the passenger, and we'll be able to pull this guy out. All right, all those nuts holding the subframe to the frame rails are removed, so let's go ahead and start lowering down the subframe. All right, so taking it out was pretty straightforward, really not that bad. I'm gonna go ahead and get this pulled outside. We'll hook up the pressure washer and we'll try and blast off some of this grease and grime. Now, I don't want to get any water inside my power steering system, so I'll go ahead and tape these guys off with some black duct tape and then we will get to spraying. All right, so that was the initial blast. Now I'm gonna go ahead and soak it in a heavy-duty degreaser, and we'll let it sit for a bit, and then we'll spray it off one more time. All right, so the degreaser's been able to soak for probably 15 minutes or so. So we'll go ahead and spray it down for the last time, let it sit and dry. So we're gonna go ahead and let the subframe dry. I think I'm probably gonna hit it with a coat of paint just to cover up some of the worn, rusty parts, but not really planning on doing much to the subframe right now. Upcoming project, I'll probably work on the ball joints and whatnot. So I'm gonna go ahead and kind of start on the fuel line. So just a size comparison, these are the Hikes lines compared to the Dash 8 AN. So it's kind of tight in the back, so I'm probably not going to be able to get underneath to the fittings back there for the fuel lines, but I've disconnected all the little brackets and stuff underneath. So what I might just kind of do in the meantime is get my feed line set up and then bolted to the frame rail over there. And here's the stock fuel line. They're just kind of hanging there. All the brackets all the way back are already taken off, so I just kind of need to get to the fuel tank and disconnect it from that side. So I'll probably line up the Dash 8 along the frame rail right here, at least get the fuel feed in position, and kind of just put the line back there for the time being, and then once the engine's back in, I could go ahead and raise the back end up again. So yeah, we'll kind of get started on that. Taking a look in the engine bay where that line's going to be routed, pretty much going to follow the OEM path of the existing fuel lines. I'm going to tie it into the frame rail right here where the existing bracket was. Make a small radius so the fitting is facing up in this direction, because it's going to go straight into the radium filter right there. We'll tie it back into the frame rail just behind the steering shaft, and then make a small radius so it follows the curvature of the floor pan. Jeez. So yeah, I can't really get to the back of the car, so we'll tie it in underneath at a couple points, and until we get the engine in place, this will kind of hold us over for now. On the ends of the hard line, I'm going to be using a Vibrant Performance tube adapter fitting. So for a Dash 8 AN male, the way that this works is it has a little collet inside. Go ahead and open this up and show you. So there you go. So what you do is you put it on the back nut, place the collet on there, and then as you compress it, it's going to deform the collet and make a nice tight seal for that hard line. Alright, so the fitting for the fuel feed is done. A little bit better lighting outside of the car. So you can see the route of that line there tucked along the frame rail, kind of where the OEM line was. So for the time being, I'm going to go ahead and just kind of button up this little connection here. So I went ahead and put on the 45-degree fitting onto the male end that's coming off the hard line. So we'll just make a short hose just to bridge that gap. And I'll probably tie in the hard line in a couple more places underneath the frame rail, just so it's kind of out of the way for when the transmission goes back in, because you can see the coil down there. And then we'll kind of call this done for now. Before I put the engine back in, I'm going to go ahead and swap out this bushing on the steering input shaft for a GK Tech unit. So you got a combination of 13 and 12 millimeter, and you can see that they're going opposite directions here. So go ahead and zap this off, and then we'll start working on the engine. Alright guys, so the time has finally come to put this together, get it back in the car. So let's take a look at what the game plan is. First things first, get the engine up in the air, mount it to the subframe, bring the trans over on the jack and bring that up to height, and then put it all together. The subframe I have on one of these little automotive dollies, and then my creeper, and then a piece of plywood just to stabilize it and make it high enough so that the hoist could get underneath it. It's kind of like these guys. So the game plan is get everything together and use the dollies to just slide underneath. I use the hoist to lift the front end up. It's at like 32 inches from the bottom, which should be enough clearance. If not, I'll just hook the hoist back up to the frame rails where the subframe mounts and lift it up a little bit more. So I had to go pick up some taller jack stands that go up to like 22 inches to make sure it's up high enough, but if you don't have the lift, do what you gotta do. All right, so first things first, let's go ahead and hook up the hoist to the engine, and then we'll get that in the air and start mating it to the subframe. Now I had to take off the engine mounts in order to clear the legs on the hoist, so once it gets up in the air, I'll go ahead and bolt it back together. But for now, let's go ahead and get this mounted up. Went ahead and taped off all the brackets too, just to protect the powder coating. All right, guys, she is up in the air. So now, next step is to bring it on over, center it on the subframe, and then go ahead and mount those two together. But before I do that, let's go ahead and reinstall these Nismo mounts. Easy. So the engine mount is in the slot on the subframe, and here's the new hardware for that. But you can tell that most of the weight's still kind of leaning towards the back. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and unhook the hoist, move the hoist around to the back side, probably leave it hooked up to that bracket and probably one on the bell housing, just so I could kind of lift up the ass end of the engine so that sits flush, and I'll go ahead and bolt these down. All right, trick worked. So now let's go ahead and put on the new hardware. All right, well, the engine is mounted to the subframe, so now let's go ahead and get the transmission in place, and we'll go over how to bolt that guy up. Before we made it up, let's put some high temp grease on the splines of the input shaft. You don't want to put too much because you don't want it to fly off and get on the plates of your clutch. We'll just kind of give everything a good coat. Clean off any excess off the bearing there. All right, so I'll go ahead and slide this into position and then use the jack to kind of match the angle that the engine is sitting at, and we'll go ahead and get these guys made together. All right, guys, so the trans and the engine are mated. But I gotta say, that was way more of a pain in the ass than I had originally anticipated. Getting the input shaft past the new clutch discs, everything was just so tight. And the way that I have it on here with the dolly, every time I push forward, the engine would kind of scoot forward a little bit. So I ended up kind of just stopping filming at one point because I was just kind of going back and forth and trying to, figure out the process and the angle and what would work, and taking it off and wondering, what's getting in my way, like what's fouling me up. And I could see like one disc was just like a butt hair higher than the other disc. So I don't know if that was the issue. But anyways, I got it together. I got it like almost down to the block, and I had to put some bolts in on either side and kind of work it down like a couple millimeters at a time just to make sure it's not putting any tension on either side and getting anything out of whack. So it was together, and then I kind of started second guessing. I'm like, why was that so tough to go together? Did I push the pilot bearing in too far? It was something like interfering. So I pulled the goddamn thing off again, checked everything. Of course it was fine. So, better be safe than sorry, right? So I just put it back on. The first time it took me a couple hours because, honestly, I kind of stopped and walked away, and I put the hoist on the engine and then put the hoist back on the trans and used the jack to try and, figure out this fucking cattywampus angle. At one point, I noticed that the board that the engine's sitting on the dolly, was kind of fouling out the bell housing, so I had to lift the engine back up and adjust everything. So yeah, pain in the fucking ass. But it's together. So last step, because I'm gonna freaking call it a day. My back's a little weeded, and I'm gonna go have 1 or 6 beers. I don't know, we'll see. We're gonna put in some new hardware around the bell housing. I'll show you what sizes are required, and then we'll torque them down. So as far as the new hardware, this is what you guys are gonna need. It takes 4 60mm 10 by 1.5 bolts. And as always, get yourself the lock washer and the flat washer. You're gonna need 1 50mm 10 by 1.5 and 4 40mm 10 by 1.5. Okay, so let's go take a look where around the bell housing all these are gonna go, and then we'll tighten it down and then we'll torque them. So if we look at the bell housing from the transmission side, right, here's where your starter goes. You're gonna have 4 of the 60mm long bolts. So basically one of them is gonna be down here underneath where your starter is. You can see I have a temporary bolt right there. So there's 1 60mm. Both the top ones are gonna be a 60mm. And then if you go to the passenger side of the engine, this first one is also gonna be a 60. So really the top half are all 60mm, okay? If we take a look down here on the driver's side, right past where your slave cylinder is going to mount, this is going to be a 50mm. So you're going to have a 50mm bolt coming through here with a nut. So that's going to be the only one that has a nut fastener on it. The other ones are all underneath. If we take a look at the passenger side, you can see one right here that comes in from the engine facing this way. And obviously I can't really get to them right now. So once the car or the engine's back in the car and I have access to that, I'll put in the 3 that go underneath, but those are gonna be your 40mm, okay? So again, 40 underneath, you have your 60, 60, 60, 60, and then 50 with the nut, okay? So I'm gonna just thread on the new hardware, get everything tight, and then we'll torque it down. Now before I take this one out and the one underneath the starter, I'm just going to go ahead and tighten down these top 2. Again, we're not really torquing anything down just yet. I just want to get it tight so it doesn't come apart again. I got to start from scratch all over again. Now these are tight, we're gonna go ahead and torque them down. There really is no sequence, but you always wanna kind of do like an opposite star type pattern just to make sure everything's nice and snug and even. Again, I can't get to the ones that are underneath right now, so I'll do those once it's in the car. But the spec is between like 29 and 35 foot-pounds. I'm gonna shoot for 33. Really don't have to do it in any sort of staging or sequence. So again, just kind of alternate what bolt we're working on, and then we're gonna get them down to 33 foot-pounds. All right, so just a double check for a good measure, but that's it. We're gonna call it a day. See you tomorrow. Good morning, everybody. After some much needed liquid therapy, we're ready to go ahead and finish this up. So we got the engine, the trans, the subframe all mated yesterday. There's a couple more things that we have to button up on the engine and the trans before it goes back underneath the car and into the engine bay. So let's take a look at those couple things and then we'll get started. Now on the driver's side, a couple things that we have to button up is installing our new starter. This is a Duralast unit. It's a 16203, so off the shelf. No need to find your JDM counterpart. Slightly different, but works totally fine. We have to reinstall our front prop shaft. Now the part that goes in the transfer case is splined, so that just slides into place. And then this side that goes to the front diff, we have 4 nuts and bolts that we have to assemble. Need to reconnect these little vent lines. I should have done it yesterday when we tightened up the bell housing, but no big deal. Just back out that top bolt. We'll go ahead and get that into place. And then we also have to run another portion of our wire harness around for our oil pressure, or sorry, your oil temp, and then some leads that go to the fuse box. So we'll kind of take a look at the harness real quick, and then we'll move on to reinstalling these parts here. So this portion of the harness we have to route from behind the engine. And it goes behind where the sandwich adapter and your oil cooler is, and that's your oil temperature sensor. So a little spade connector plugs in back there. And then we have our leads that go to our fuse box, and then one for our alternator as well. So one of the things that this wire harness, the Pro harness, does is it removes the need for the charge cable that goes between the alternator and the starter. So everything's already incorporated into this here. We just have to run a good chassis ground from the block to the chassis. But that's about it. So I already connected this guy, just plugs in the back there. We'll leave these guys free, so it plugs in by our fuse box. So let's go get our starter in place. All right, so again, one of the benefits of doing everything out of the car is you actually have room to get everything fitted without using a bunch of extensions and scraping the hell out of your arm. Now, this starter is slightly different as far as the build is concerned compared to our stock unit, but it does fit. It's going to be a little bit tight with the heater core lines that are coming in. So I'm going to go ahead and connect the leads now, and then we'll kind of get it up into place, thread the bolts through, and go ahead and tighten it down. All right, so you can see just how tight it is with the solenoid being mounted in that position versus being on the side of the body over here. But it does clear everything. I just kind of had to push the hoses up a little bit to make room for the plug on the back side. So we'll go ahead and tighten down our lead for our power, and we'll tighten down the bolts for the starter itself, and that one's done. Last thing we have to do before we could go ahead and slide this guy back underneath the car is reinstall our front prop shaft. So the transfer case side is splined, so that's just going to slide right into our case there. And then we'll bring this flange over, make sure we get the proper alignment with the bolt holes there. We'll go ahead and bring our bolts through. Should go through the front side here. Put on our lock washer with the nut. Rotate this around. Alright, so now you need to tighten these bolts down, but the only problem is that the input shaft is going to rotate when you're putting pressure on it. So get yourself a screwdriver, jam it through there. So with the prop shaft all connected, now we just need to plug in the leads for our transmission off of our harness. Now this harness does away with the neutral switch, so I'm going to go ahead and plug in the connector for reverse. And then instead of running the cable type driven speedometer, I'm switching mine over to a digital unit. I got a sending unit from Brant's in the UK, so I got to figure out how to wire it up, but part of the harness, they wired it for a digital input. So go ahead and leave this guy loose for right now until I get a chance to work on that. So reverse is plugged in. Go ahead and tuck this in to some of these clamps. I give myself some slack here. All right, let's put her on. All right, so here's the plan. Again, everything is on a dolly, so it's just gonna slide. The car is like 35 inches in the air right now on some 6-ton truck jack stands, and it is like just barely enough, to the point that once I get to the front cover, I'm gonna have to put the jack underneath the trans, lift up the trans a little bit to kind of offset this height, so it clears the bottom of the rad support. Okay, so here goes nothing. Just so you could see how absolutely close this is gonna be. All right, so now Need to get the jack underneath this point here where the box of wiring is kind of tucked underneath, and we'll lift up the back end, kind of drop the front end, push it in. Alright, so there's a little bracket back here that I'm going to have to remove so it doesn't hit the turbo. So I'll just go pop that off real quick. All right, so it is under. I kind of have to move it a little into position, but I definitely cleared my biggest hurdle, which was this lower portion of the radiator support. So, oh man, just a little tight. All right, so now to kind of line it up a little bit better, and then we'll work on lowering the car back down onto the engine. So this sucker is tight. What I'm gonna have to do is take off the compressor housing cover, kind of make some room, because it's a little too fat to fit between those frame rails. You can see where the throttle cable bracket on the intake manifold would hit the, hit the frame there. So pull it back out, and we'll take off the compressor housing cover. So I ended up just pulling off the entire turbo and the wastegate just to kind of keep as much room as possible on the passenger side, because yeah, it is so tight. I also pulled off the throttle bracket, or throttle cable bracket as well. So we'll try and sandwich this guy in. Let's slide it back underneath, and we'll see how she fits. So that definitely gives plenty of room on the exhaust side. And now we'll go ahead and pull the hoist over and lower the car down. And we'll see about getting the engine and the trans pulled up and bolted in. All right, so the car is lowered back down around the engine. Still have maybe inch and a half, 2 inches on either side of clearance before it hits the chains. So I went ahead and put the jack stands back in place. It's more of a manageable height compared to the 35 inches in the air that it was before. Overall, everything's looking pretty good. Gonna have to pull it up a little bit so that bracket doesn't get caught there. But I'll go ahead and take the hoist off the frame rails, and we'll connect it to the engine, and then we'll lift the engine and the trans up into place, bolt it down. All right, so hoist is on, so we'll start lifting up the engine, and then at the same time, we'll jack the transmission up so we could bolt both subframes back into place. All right, so close. So here's the stud coming out of the frame, and then here is the hole in the subframe. So literally inches away from getting this back in. All right. Let's take a look at this side. This side's a little more off just because of the way that the engine kind of sits. So we'll use the jack to kind of counteract that and get that up into place. I had to pull off the intercooler just to make some more room so you can see where the power steering and the oil coolers are mounted. But kind of get some more forward room there. Home stretch, here we go. All right, so everything is almost in. Went ahead and got the trans subframe underneath mounted to the frame. So that way I could go ahead and pull out the jack and use that underneath the front subframe to kind of help keep that nice and level. All right, so I still got to tighten up the passenger side, but the driver's side is decently tight. All right, so everything is in. Got to pull out these old fuel lines out of the way, make sure that we get the steering input shaft lined up once that comes in, but you kind of see how everything's kind of tilting a little bit more towards the intake side. So with the jack underneath the subframe on this side, hopefully kind of level everything out and get it in. You can see how this is, you know, we're maybe 4 inches or so off on that side. I'm only about 1.5 inches, 2 inches off. All right, so almost there, home stretch. I'm just gonna kind of bring out the dolly and whatnot and then start jacking this up into place. The next big pain in the ass is actually this steering column part. So there's a flat, right? It's all splined all the way around. The splines are pretty fine. But there's a flat part on the section of the column that comes down to the rack, right? And it has to go into this U-joint that you put a bolt through and it tightens it together. So getting them lined up is a bit of a pain in the butt, but yeah, just to know what you got to do. All right, so the nose of that column is inside the joint. I already started to lift it up, and you can see that the bolts from the frame are already starting to come through the subframe. So we are almost there, guys, almost there. All right, so the rear part of the subframe is bolted in. Gonna drop down the jack, everything's still supported by the hoist, and then we're gonna bring the jack forward on the subframe and then bring it up and in position. So front part of the subframe is up. I'm just gonna put the nuts on these guys real quick and then I'll lift it up the rest of the way. And the passenger side still has a small little gap, so I'll go ahead and get the nut started on the bolts, and then I'll bring the jack over and we'll lift up this corner and cinch it down. Okay, up just a little bit. Keep going. Keep going. Stop. Perfect. I'm so excited. Let's bolt the sucker down. She's officially bolted in. Yes! All right, so now that's in, I could go ahead and take the hoist off the engine. I'm gonna go ahead and jack it up just a little bit to take it off the larger stands, drop it down to a more manageable height so I can start working on putting back on everything that I had to take off in order to get this big fucker in. It's been a hell of a weekend, man. This is definitely a process if you're gonna do it this way. It is a bit easier in some regards and more difficult in others. But it went in, and that's all that matters. So I'm gonna go ahead and get this removed. We'll get it a little bit lower to the floor. Done. I heard it hit the floor. It's okay. It's been a long day, man. Well, the motor is back in the bay for the first time since, what, last winter, I guess. I parked it in November, so probably around December or January did I pull it. So it is back in under its own weight, back down on jack stands underneath the subframe. So now I can go ahead and get the ass end back up in the air, start working on the fuel system, put back everything that I had to take apart in order to get this thing in here. So let's take a look. I'm not even gonna say anything, just appreciate it. Woo. All right, guys, that is it. It is back in. This one's done, but this would not have been possible without the help of this guy. Dad, internet, this is my dad.
Hey, guys.
My free labor for the weekend. So
Loved it.
it wouldn't have been possible. So thank you so much for all of this help. And it's in. All right, guys, back to work. Have a good one.